Welcome everyone to our last presentation until the fall. I'm Ruth Murgatroyd and I'm your York-Sunbury Historical Society volunteer hostess. Let's begin by asking Evelyn to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ruth. I want to introduce our lovely Leah Grandy. She's also on our board of directors of the York-Sunbury Historical Society and is my co-partner in programming. And I'm very fortunate to have her. So I'm just going to give you a bit of her background. Leah has a PhD in history and she works regularly with documents, as we're going to find out tonight, from the 18th and 19th century New Brunswick. And she's got a few other specialties, especially including Loyalist biography and this amazing Lost Loyalist project that you really have to look up. 18th century naming practices, New Brunswick newspapers, which she's really fully immersed in right now, and maritime sports and historical blogging. So I'm not going to take up any of Leah's time. I'm looking forward to hearing her. So over to you, Leah.
Thanks so much, Evelyn. So I'm really happy to share this topic about paleography tonight. It's one of my favorites. And how I got interested in paleography was I was working with some young historians 10 or 15 years ago now. And it was at that point that handwriting was stopped being taught in a lot of New Brunswick curriculum. So we were seeing young adults that didn't know cursive writing, but wanted to interact with historical documents. So I started developing some expertise in helping people, give them a little hints and pointers so they could get their feet wet and not feel so intimidated about tackling historical documents. Because I think it's really important to look at historical documents in their original format. So I really encourage people to do that. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to paleography, talk a little bit about writing materials and writing styles and variations in handwriting that occur. And I'm going to be focusing in on 18th and 19th century British Atlantic handwriting, which is mostly what I work in, my specialty, and that's the reason for that. But it's a type of writing you're going to come across very often in New Brunswick. We're going to talk about tackling writing errors and how to approach that, and also some techniques you can use to interpret historic handwriting, and then some do's and don'ts of transcription if you're going to engage in that to understand the documents you're working with. So some of you, paleography is a word maybe a lot of people haven't heard before, and all paleography is the art of reading and deciphering historic handwriting and looking at historic manuscripts. And so we're talking about cursive writing. So cursive writing versus typescript is what we're mainly concerned about tonight, although typescript has changed over time as well. And but that's a whole other presentation, I think. So when you're approaching paleography, the good news and the bad news is you get it really good at it through experience. So what I'm going to do tonight is just give you some tips and examples, but really how you get good at it is through experience and different periods, different types of documents, and even specific writers can be specialties that you develop an eye for after looking at many, many documents. And I would say that the skills you use to interpret handwriting are very similar to reading skills and learning a new language. So if that's something you have an aptitude for, which I find a lot of young people do, then it's something that comes along fairly quickly. So just like when you're doing any type of historical research, when you're looking at a specific document, it's important to understand the context of that document before you tackle it. That's going to help you interpret the handwriting. So it's important to do background reading on the subject area, and you may come up with certain standard phrases. Say if you're doing medical history research, you'd want to know some 19th century medical terms before you start trying to look at medical documents. That would just going to make your job easier. And also terminology changes over time. So I'm going to give you some examples of that, how it's sometimes important to know the historic terminology versus the modern terminology. So writing is going to vary by place, time, and individual writer. Sometimes those areas, place, time, and individuals may be identified in the actual document. Sometimes when they're not, you can actually use the writing itself to identify place, time, or individuals potentially. So it works both ways in paleography. So when you have any type of document, the best way to approach it is to ask who created this document, if you don't know right away. Where and when was it created? And why was it created? What was its purpose and the motivation? And then the last question, when you're dealing with an original document, is what materials were used in its creation? I'm going to get into that a little bit more now. So writing materials. So writing materials are important for paleography because the objects you use to write, what you write with, and the object you write on actually dictate how the writing itself is formed. So the little example I have for you up here is cuneiform. So you have a wooden stylus there and a clay tablet. So how the writing appears is actually shaped by the tools that you are using. So, and what we're going to be talking about tonight, some of the main surfaces that are used would be parchment and vellum, so from animal skin. So this would be for more important documents, usually not for every day. During the 18th century, paper tended to be more handmade paper, linen and cotton based. Early paper in New Brunswick, like sometimes old used sailcloth was used in the making of paper. And interestingly, that type of paper survives usually pretty well. But then in the 19th century, you have more mass-produced paper that has an acidic quality to it and breaks down very quickly. So that's what we kind of think of for newsprint, that type of paper. So you might come across both those types of paper. For writing utensils, you may get a lot notations, especially in pencil. So lead pencil, although graphite was really used very early, not lead for pencils. You could have in the 18th century, you could have manufactured writing devices, or you could have homemade quills that were cut, and you could have manufactured ink or homemade ink. You did have metal nibs in the second half of the 18th century and fountain pens as early as the 1830s. But you'll see a lot of variation in writing depending on what writing devices people are using. Some of the interesting issues, those physical issues you come across with original documents, or you could have blotches, certain types of inks fade over time. Certainly paper discolors with time, water molding. When it discolors with time, it's called foxing. You could have tears and missing pieces, which can be very frustrating at times. Wrinkles and folds in the paper that make it hard to read. If you have a really good conservator, like they do at the provincial archives here, sometimes you can deal with that. And one of the other issues you have is bleeding. If somebody uses both sides of the paper, you can have the ink come through. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of those issues. So with blotting and spots, so we have that example there, the word Great Britain, if you can make that out, has a spot right in the middle there, but doesn't really obscure the word. We can still see it. But then down below it there, we have the word maybe Bangor, so spotting can make it harder to interpret. The document to the right, I would say this is a good example of somebody that was having some issues with their pen. They didn't have a good quill that day or having issues with their ink, that the ink was blotting for them there, and it can make it harder for us to interpret in the future. This is probably my favorite example of bleeding here. You can see that the document was used on both sides, and maybe the paper was thin, maybe the ink was quite dark, and this writer had quite a slant to their writing. And one thing you can do is really concentrate on that slant, and you can see it slants to the right. So you would concentrate on looking at that slant to try to interpret the writing. And this document here has a Fredericton connection. It's kind of hard to see because this writing is a difficult one and it's one I give to people to practice transcribing. It's actually one of the original versions of a visit from St. Nicholas from the Odell family papers. And one of Jonathan Odell's daughters is thought to actually have written this out. You can see very quickly, and there's variations in this that are really interesting. And you see I wrote possibly by Clement Clark Moore, because there's a whole debate about whether he was actually the author of this very early American poem or not. All right, so getting into some of the styles of writing, or the term we use in paleography is hands. So types of writing would be hands. So what we mean by that are grades and types of writing associated usually with the purpose of the text. So there used to be many different types of writing for many purposes. Now we've kind of narrowed that down in modern times, but you still think about if you're writing a letter to your great aunt, you're probably going to use different handwriting than if you're writing yourself a grocery list, right? So different types, different purposes. Some of the terms we use to talk about hands are aspect. So that's the overall appearance of how that type of hand looks. And the ductus is the way in which it's actually executed. So that means the speed, it's what it's written, the number of strokes, which are actually called minims, to make a letter, and how the letters are formed, because this has changed over time, changed with style. So a little bit of the history of cursive. The very early cursive was known as charter hand or court hand. And then that evolved into secretary as more documents began being produced and more books were mass produced by hand. This is before printing was popularized. And you had rounder, quicker strokes. So this, you could write quicker. And that's the whole root of cursive writing, is that it was developed to write quickly. Curo comes from the Latin word for run. So the pen is not lifted off the paper when you're doing cursive writing. So it speeds the process of writing. So the type of writing that you're going to see very commonly in the period we're going to talk about here, 18th century and into the 19th century, especially in formal documents, is what we call copperplate writing. So this example here is from 1792, right in Fredericton. So it's very concentrated and even along the center of the letters, I would say. That's how I describe it. And copperplate was definitely influenced as printing became popularized, and vice versa, printing was influenced by writing as well. Sometimes within the same document, especially in the 18th and 19th century, you're going to have different types of scripts in the same document. So this is an example here of a land petition of Elizabeth, or a loyalist petition, sorry, from Elizabeth Green, which was written in New Brunswick, but she was actually in Keswick, her land was. And you can see that the kind of formal script at the top, the introductory part, is in one type of script, and then the body of the letter is in a different planar script, and that's a very common way you'd see documents presented. So variations in writing. I'm going to talk about how you see changes in writing and what can affect writing as well. So just like today, different people have different styles of writing. And I've often found myself going through a series of documents where there was one clerk recording something and I just got used to their writing and how to read it. And then, a new clerk comes on and you have to learn their little tricks in their writing. So we see this for the document in the upper right. This person has a very distinctive capital S here in their writing. Well, this person on the bottom here has quite pronounced serifs. So that's the end part on the end of their letter, some of their letters there, which is pretty distinctive. I will note too, and you'll see these very curly lowercase d's in that copperplate type writing. That's very common. You'll see that. And here's a great example, also from 18th century New Brunswick, of two writers on the same document. So they're both providing testimonial. I much prefer to try to interpret writer 2's writing than writer 1. So just like I can't really complain about that too much, because even though I look and interpret other people's handwriting quite often, my writing itself is not very neat. So probably people are going to have struggle with my writing in the future. You're going to see a variety in speed. So is somebody taking their time to do this writing? So like your letter to your great aunt, or are they trying to take notes very quickly? And this is an example of taking notes quickly. These are for minutes of county court records for Kings County. And you can just tell that this person was writing at speed. And I'll show you some examples. Sometimes these were just drafts. Sometimes people would take drafts just like we do now, and then you type up your minutes later. But this was done fairly quickly. So some factors that actually affect the writer themselves, we know different things can affect our writing is not exactly the same all the time. So the health of the writer, if you have an injury to your hand, your writing's going to change. I know I had carpal tunnel in my writing hand for a while, and my writing was quite different. If we're focused, if we have care and concentration on what we're doing, your writing is going to be different. The age of the writer. If you're young and you're learning to write, you're going to see that. But then also as people age, sometimes their writing changes. I'm going to show you an example of that. If you're tired, and especially now, I think people get tired writing because a lot of people don't actually have the muscles in their hands to write very long either. So that can change your writing. So stress, of course, too, the mental condition of the writer. If they're under the influence of something too, can change writing as well, drugs or alcohol. And your actually writing conditions. If you're writing something in a battlefield or in a carriage, this is going to affect the end product. So that's kind of some of the interesting tidbits you might be able to glean from looking at an original document, is some of these conditions. So this is the example here I wanted to show you of, this is a signature of Ward Chipman Jr., who is from quite a well-known Loyalist family, Ward Chipman of New Brunswick, the son of Ward Chipman. This signature was done in the mid-19th century, just a couple years before he passed away. So you can see this tremor of old age in this signature, which is gives you this interesting insight into his health that you might not have if you're just looking at a transcription. Also, a note about signatures, as you may have come across this in research before. Not everybody was literate, not everybody had a signature, which is kind of an interesting come around now that some young people that don't learn cursive writing don't have a signature now either. Not to the point I think they couldn't write their name, but we see that some of the Kronk family here who are applying for a land grant, have just made their mark. You can say it says Mary Kronk at the top, her mark, Benjamin Kronk, his mark, and they just have made a little X there. Now, I do want to make a really important note. Like I said, I'm concentrating my examples on one specific type of writing from the British Atlantic world, but writing varies immensely by area and culture, sometimes very much so. So for example, some things doing New Brunswick research that you might run into New York Dutch handwriting, that's going to be completely different than from the British Empire. New France writing looks completely different from the 18th and 17th century than what examples I'm showing you. And this is a great example here, 1722 from Scotland. You can see how that's quite different again. So I'm trying to give you some general tips, but then the specific examples are from this particular type of writing. So yes, I'm going to get into more specific tackling of 18th and 19th century North American and Great Britain documents. So some specific examples and issues you'll come across. Phonetic spellings. This is something that throws people off. Spellings, for one thing, had not been standardized in a lot of cases, and not everybody was fully literate when they were writing different levels of education. So that is very possible that you're going to come across phonetic spellings. I find this is especially important when looking at how names are written. You can come across different spellings of the same word, and the same word in the same document, but different spellings. And also many variations in spellings of names right up into the 19th century, especially surnames. Uppercase letters are one of the big differences in 18th and early 19th century handwriting. Your capital K, P, and R's can look very similar, J's and T's, L's and S's. So sometimes it can be useful to have a key to look at examples of writing of particular letters. You also might have doubling or singling of consonants and also vowels, where we wouldn't have it in more modern writing, but that usually doesn't make it that much harder to read. But just being aware, and I wouldn't say it's correct or incorrect spelling, it's just the way it was spelled at the time. So some examples of those spellings, and also I'll use the term archaic words, so words that we no longer have in common use in modern language, but were commonly used in the past. Those are good things to be aware of as well. So you might think you're reading a word incorrectly, but it's just a word we don't use very much anymore. So here's some examples here. We have the word maybe forthcoming, and we have a maybe split up, an extra E, and also an extra E in forthcoming. Then we have the name of a couple ships here. The Golden Lion with a Y instead of an I. So we have interchangeable vowels. And then we have an E added to the end of hawk there as well. And here's just some examples of capital letters. There were some common forms, but of course they're going to vary from person to person. So Dawkins there has a capital D. This is a capital K over here to the right. And then James Hunter, that's an H there. So different than the standard capital letters we use in cursive writing today. Also, one thing that when I'm introducing people to this type of documents, they get thrown by capitalization, because during this time, people use capitalization differently than we do today. They tended to use uppercases more frequently and in different places than we would today. We can see this sentence here, behalf and whereas, all capitalized. And I always say the best practice is to, if you're doing a transcription, to write it exactly as you see it, including the capitalization. One of the ones people, if you've done any type of this type of document, is the long S, the double S that this throws people off the first couple times they see it. And we see it kind of looks like an FS. It's not quite an F. It's got a backwards loop on the bottom. And this indicates a double S. And this kind of comes into printing conventions as well. You'll see those in printed documents. So this word is not commission, it's commission. One of the really fun things when you look at the 18th century documents is flourishes. I love them. And this is a great example right in the middle here from Fredericton, January 29, 1787, Monson Hoyt. And he people like to do a fancy flourish after their name. But you could also put flourishes, often were done at the beginning of the first sentences or new paragraphs. And so it's an art to it as well, right? There's an artistic aspect for sure. Punctuation is the other thing you're going to find is quite different. So the same way as capitalization was not the same as today, punctuation sometimes is non-existent. You can see again, these are minutes from a county court record. So somebody was taking them fairly quickly, but there's almost no punctuation here, or it could be very irregular compared to modernization. And as printing became more widespread and more material was printed, that's kind of punctuation became standardized hand in hand with printing. I have one more example of that. So this is a letter from Richard Corn Capone, was a really interesting individual. He was a Black loyalist who ended up getting land in the Grand Bay Westfield area, but then went to Sierra Leone. So he's writing a letter to John Clarkson in England in 1793. And he has, you can see there's not really any identifiable punctuation in that letter, which is not uncommon. So you're going to come across abbreviations that are, some of them are the same as the type of abbreviations we use today, and the purpose of abbreviations the same as today, to save space and time. Some of them are different, some of them are the same. So again, we have the word commissioned at the top there, which has a double M, but we have this mark over the M to indicate that that letter has been singled. We have over here the word receipt. This is the word received. We've got that backwards kind of flip to the D, that's copperplate. Sometimes you'll have an apostrophe there. So commonly used words like in inventories and lists, those are ones you often see abbreviated. Ditto is used quite often, or even abbreviation of ditto. So sometimes words are letters are left out, an apostrophe is added. Sometimes symbols and marks are used. So down at the bottom example here, we have the first one circled is, we would call it like an ampersand that we still use today. That's pretty recognizable. Of course, many documents talk about His Majesty's reign. So this is the word majesty down here, and we have a comma, M-A-J, comma, S. And often when you have abbreviations during this time, the last letter of the word is in superscript. So that means it's raised up above the normal line of the lettering. So this is something to keep your eye on. So one of the areas I've studied is naming in the 18th and 19th century, particularly in New Brunswick. And there is a pretty core pool of names to draw upon. And this is one of the really common abbreviations that you're going to see is for common names. And this is really useful for people researching individuals. I know when I started looking at my family history as a teenager, I thought I had a great grandfather named Chaz, but that's the abbreviation that's used for Charles. So we have some examples here in a list of captains, William, and you can, at the very top there, you can see W-I-L-L, period, with a superscript of an M. The next one there would be for James, J-A, with a superscript of the S. George is usually G-E-O. And a different variation of William under Isaac there, just W-M. The only one that can be sometimes tricky is Jonathan versus John. At the very bottom there, next to the ship Albion, we have John Smith, of course, which would be a nightmare for any genealogist, a name to try to research. But we see a J-N and a superscript O, which would be the common abbreviation for John. Numerals, they can throw you off too, because they changed over time as well. And some people struggle with that, especially if you're going through a document and you're looking for reference numbers on the document. If they're written at the time, they definitely have changed over time. Sometimes 2s and 4s look the same, 5s and 6s, 7, 9s. We can see in this first, the 26th of November, 1777, the 7s go quite below the writing line, and that's not abnormal. This one in the middle is a nice example because you have a stamped page number and then a written page number. So you may think that's 757, but it's actually 157. So to be careful about that. And at the bottom here, okay, yeah, we have a date. The date's not too hard to read, but then often surrounding a date too, you're going to have reference to the king. And this one's abbreviation of Anno Domini to the king, or also to Jesus as well. So those are common conventions when looking at dates. So some errors you might come across and how to deal with those. Oh, and this is a shot I really like. This was from the Morehouse House in King's Landing. You can have certainly corrections. Just like now, people made mistakes and crossed them out and wrote other things as well. They use caret marks to insert things that they left out. Sometimes you can read what's under what's struck out, sometimes you can't. But that's one of the interesting things about looking at original documents, is trying to interpret that, and if there's important information from the mistake. This is from a libel case from Fredericton, and so the part that's struck out might actually have some interesting content in it. So I'd encourage you to try to read that. Oops. So the official term, if you add something, would be an assertion, and if you took something out, it's an excision. So some examples of that here. So you have another New Brunswick land petition. So, oops, they put 3 acres instead of 300 acres. That's quite a difference. So they added a little caret mark there and added the 100. And from the county court records here, we see, again, these are probably rougher notes that something's crossed out and something else is added. If writing is really challenging and has been done very quickly, one of the things you might run across is that your dots and crosses, like your I's and T's, might not be exactly where they're supposed to be. So sometimes you have to track them down and be like, okay, that's maybe an I, because there's the dot to the I a little further off, and that will help you out. In some particular individuals' writing styles, they're going to have long ascenders and descenders, which can be a challenge if they're writing their lines very close together. So by ascenders, I mean letters that go up, like T, like H, like B. So we have some examples out here, and ones that go by descenders, ones that go down, like your G's and your Y's. So this person, the writing kind of overlaps. So you're going to have to look at very carefully to make sure you're looking at the letter that goes with the correct word. If you're lucky, you may have an original and a copy, like a rough draft, and then a final version. And it's interesting to compare that. So those are Legislative Council journals. It's from Nova Scotia. So an example of that, where it is the same writer, but they've done their quick copy as the session was happening, and then done the good copy later on. But sometimes you have to assess a document and try and figure out, is this a draft that I'm looking at, or a very formal document that has no errors in it? And that can tell you something about the purpose of the document. One of the really cool things you can find in original documents is notations. So when somebody came along and added a little something extra in it, so the fancy term for that is marginalia. And this one here in these county court minutes, you have somebody doing a tally here at the beginning of the minutes. All right, so now I'm going to give you some techniques you can use to actually start tackling documents. So these are some tips that I've developed from helping other people, from dealing with documents myself. And so you can try some of them out. Maybe you already do these type of things when you're looking at documents, and hopefully there's something new there as well. So you probably, if it's a challenging document, you're going to be frustrated if you try to read and understand the whole document at first. So just try start identifying individual words to start with. And then you'll get the content and the context eventually. So I usually, when I'm looking at a document, I try to transcribe it. That's definitely a useful way to learn paleography for sure. And that's the end product a lot of time you're looking for. So you want to start by writing down the words you know, but don't be afraid to leave blanks. Just go through and write down what you can easily interpret, and then leave a blank and come back to it later. So if you've identified a particular letter or words within that document, it makes it much easier to match it with other words and letters in the document that may be similar, especially if you're not familiar with that particular person's handwriting. You can say, oh, Their T's kind of look like this here. I know that word, it has a T, so this must be a T down here as well. Looking up unfamiliar words. This is saying, sometimes I think, I'm sure that's what that word says. I'm sure that's what that word says, but I don't know that word. One of the best places I would recommend for looking up words like that is the Oxford English Dictionary, because it has a lot of historical words as well as modern words. So you can see words that were used more in a historical context. So it's very useful. You can look at the document itself for internal evidence. Does it mention dates, places, and events? So can you go kind of research those to see if those check out? Oops. So go and research those people and places. For an example of that would be, so if you're trying to transcribe a letter of a person and you say, oh, they're talking about this other person. And then you might have had the genealogy, like, okay, that's their son they're talking about. That must be that name. That must be the name Samuel. That makes sense in that context. So really important to do your outside research as well. The same way as when you're doing any general historical research, we don't recommend you would jump in and just look at primary documents first. So documents created in the historical time, you need some background knowledge to help you tackle that primary document. If you have similar type documents, you could cross-reference them. So other documents associated with the same person or event, or if you are used to dealing with similar documents, and I'm going to show you examples, ones you deal with a lot in New Brunswick in the 18th and 19th century would be, for example, land petitions. So if you know the formula of that, that can help you interpret what you're looking at. This one, some people are not comfortable with, but read it aloud if you have to. Sometimes in an archive, you do hear people talking themselves because they're trying to figure out what it says. So don't be afraid to do that. One of a really good one is leave it, come back later if you can. If you're at an archive or you have a copy, try to make a copy so you can deal with it later, because when you come back with new eyes, often then you're like, oh, why didn't I see that before? That's what that says. Or you can actually ask somebody else, if you know somebody that's good with cursive writing, what do you think? What do you think that word says? I would recommend that you don't bias their answer by saying what you think the word is. Just let them tell you what they think it is and see if it matches your gut feeling. So here would be an example of word repetition. This is referring to a ship named Kitty. So if we know one of these words here is kitty, then it's very likely that the other word's kitty, even though it uses kind of two different writing styles. And here with some of those tricky uppercase letters that maybe vary over time. So we know, if we know this top word here is London, so we know that's a capital L. Then we know down here, we could say, okay, this maybe is a ship called Lively because the L matches the L in London. That makes sense. So you can use internal evidence from a document. So in a letter, you're going to have probably a location and a date. That's great. Hopefully you have two names as well. So that's going to help you interpret what you're seeing. And also a letter is a good example of a document format that we're talking about. Maybe not everybody today is familiar with the formula of a letter, but we know that you're probably going to have a date and a place at the top, like in this one. You're going to have a salutatory address. Then you're going to have the body of the letter, and then a signature and a goodbye at the end, which is going to help you understand what you're looking at as well. So here's that other example of kind of a formulaic document I was talking about. So land petitions, really common, and they had a very set formula to when they, especially the introductory paragraph, usually addressed to the governor with all their titles, and they're usually in the third person and calling themselves a memorialist, which might throw you off, like, what is that word? It's not a word we use today, but once you know the formula, and maybe you could learn this formula by looking at other transcriptions before you tackle an original yourself. So another example of a land petition here. This one's very, very neat and tidy with some of those examples I've been telling you, the convention of addressing the governor, how you start your petition, and then you have some variation in the script as well. This is one of an example of cross-referencing where I used two documents to figure out what I was looking at. And this is one of my very interesting documents. It's an application for a letter of marque, so to be a privateer. So they're applying, there's the names of the ships, which is, I was seeing some examples of that earlier, and the names of the captains. And I was coming across this name, which I thought said Keelock as the first name and Rusden as the second name, which is somewhat unusual. Like I said, they're usually a set pool of names during this time. I'm like, that can't be right. I must not be reading that correctly. But then I found another application for a letter of marque with the same name. So I was like, okay, there we go. That was correct. So that's an example of how you could cross-reference two documents. Like I said before, I can't emphasize research, really important. So a land petition here with a number of signatures. So I would try to interpret those signatures. Signatures can be harder sometimes because some people stylize their signatures. But the first thing I would do in this case, because I know it's a petition from loyalists, I would use a reference book like Esther Clark Wright's The Loyalists of New Brunswick, and try to look at a nominal index, name indexes, to be like, okay, I think this name, this is what this name I'm looking at. Is that a name of somebody that was in that place and time? Another example of using research, I've been showing you examples from county court records, which are a great source for community history in New Brunswick. So the county court records, they dealt with minor legal issues, but also a lot of schools, tavern licenses, also parish officers, which were generally volunteer positions, but they were had prominence in the community. But some of these positions that were important positions within the community were definitely more so in a historical context, so harder to interpret, even if the writing's good, if you don't know what words you're looking at. So one of the more interesting parish officer positions down at the bottom here. This would be a hard one if you hadn't done some contextual reading, because this word is actually hog reeves. So this is somebody that goes around and rounds up loose livestock, particularly pigs, because they can do a lot of damage to people's crops. But this is the type of example, is maybe you could read that and you'd have no guess at it unless you had that contextual understanding. All right, so when you get to the actual transcription process, I like to, when I do this type of thing in person, get people actually to do some practice transcription. So I encourage you to do that for sure. So I would emphasize that when you're doing a transcription and you're doing it for historical purposes, try really hard to write what is actually written there. Not what should have been written, not what you think should have been written, not modern terms, just write what is exactly on the page, because you could lose some important information if you alter that transcription. So stick to the original text as much as possible. I already mentioned that about capitalization and non-modern spelling. Yep, so keep your original spellings, punctuation or lack of punctuation. The breviograph, so the abbreviations like ampersand, so keep those, try to record those as accurately as possible. So certainly when you're doing a transcription, it's probably best to do it in a typed form, so it's legible to everybody. And so when you're doing crossed out words, if you can read those, you can write those and then do strike them through with your Word document, so it's clear what's going on. You can add a caret mark where insertions have occurred. Now, this is a really important thing that I use a lot and recommend people use is there's a convention of using square brackets when what's in that enclosed in that is the editor's best guess. And let me tell you, there's probably it's hard to come up with a definitive transcription of a particular document. So there's probably always going to be some things you're not 100% sure of, but with the square brackets, they indicate your best guess. If you have no idea what a word is, you can put a question mark in those brackets. And so if I'm going along, I will probably just put those brackets in as I'm going in my first run as well to indicate words that I'm not sure of. And then you can use braces where the text is missing. So it's obscured, it's ripped. Different things are actually physically wrong with the paper, something that originally we talked about at the beginning of when I was talking. And so as part of your transcription, kind of that individuality of the document, you can make notations of that as part of your transcription. You can talk about what type of script they use, different types of hands, like how that might have changed. So you can make notations of that if you think that's important at the end of your transcription. So I just want to finish off by showing you one of my, why I think it's important to look at documents in their original form and not just looked at type versions that other people have done. This is a standard church record from St. John's Church in Cornwallis, Nova Scotia, so it's Port Williams now. And it was, yeah, of course, you have deaths and burials recorded, and that's what this is. But you can see that this person drew a box around these particular deaths and burials because they, to indicate that they were something unusual. They had not done this anywhere else in the other record. So the case was, it's actually Mr. William Harris of Halifax was shipwrecked at the same time, but with 2 or more having got to shore alive and were found dead in the woods, supposed to have perished with fatigue and extreme cold. So this was an unusual death. And the writer has indicated this by making this interesting change to the writing. So it's something you might not pick up if you were not looking at the original document. So just to wrap up, so why is it important to look at documents in their original text? So you may get a sense of emotion by looking at how a particular person's writing has occurred. They're writing quickly or slowly, or how their script appeared. Those really neat notations that you often find, the marginalia, can add really something to your understanding. If you're looking at the original documents, you can look at the writing materials to potentially date the manuscript or understand how and what environment that a document was written. So the circumstances surrounding the creation of the document. And then also by looking at the original document, you can see if later additions were made, changes made, that could be quite important, or whether the content was edited. And therefore you can get more details about the document's purpose. So I would definitely recommend, if either you're a genealogist, any type of researcher working with historical documents, this is definitely a skill that's really important to work on. And I definitely encourage new historians to develop this skill.
So the first one here, Leah, is the reason that writing is different across cultures because of the different combinations of letters.
Yeah, for sure. That could be, that definitely could be the reason. And it's kind of interesting, the variations, like even within North America, like sometimes people bring me documents and like, can you help me read this? And especially say for New France, I don't have a lot of experience with that, so my eye's not used to it. So it's quite different, quite a different artistic direction for each different culture, even within immigrant cultures in North America.
Okay. Can you address the damage caused by iron gall ink? And did females write differently from the males? So let's start with the iron gall ink.
Yes, for sure. You can see damage in documents from different types of ink, for sure. And some of them lasted better than others, depending on how well they were made. And the females differently than males. different types of education. And of course, there's going to be different types of writing by class too. I often see that. For New Brunswick, for the 18th and 19th century, there are many more male produced documents than female documents. And a lot of the females I've seen, especially first generation after the Loyalist settlement, females, there's not as much literacy for sure. So that would affect writing, I think, as well.
What do you think about software that some people use to transcribe primary documents?
I don't know a lot about that. I know there's some very advanced like artificial intelligence software now. I think there's a project in like the Venice archives where because the writing is so similar, they're trying to have the automated programs to do that. But I know from dealing with optical character recognition databases, even in print, the earlier the print gets into the 17th and 18th century, the less accurate it is. So I think sometimes those artificially created ones can be good for indexing, but you still have to read the whole document or you might miss something really important. And I would say part of the reason too I started providing more paleography help is because there were so many crowdsourcing projects. I think the Fredericton Region Museum has done some of these during the pandemic, especially. A lot of people got into transcription.
What if the writer is almost illiterate and you know that what he, she really means? I find that I want to correct their writing because seriously, nobody can understand it otherwise.
Yes, yes, I've particularly I usually deal with loyalists and loyalists more from lower farming or trade backgrounds, and sometimes they're not as literate as somebody that came from the wealthier classes, and they use a lot of phonetic writing, which is so you can sound it out like that. If you want to correct the writing, if you think it's really hard to understand what they're saying, that you can use that square bracket, right? So you can write the word exactly as they spelled it, but then in your square brackets, you can do your editorial thing and put afterwards what you think the modern spelling would be.
Have you come across documents that have a second page written between the lines?
Yes, or cross-written. I think it was the Kings County Museum shared something, yeah, recently, because I mean, if paper could be expensive, and that's why people writing on both sides, you get the bleeding too, right? Is they are trying to use the paper as efficiently as they could. And often, yeah, especially in letters, it's going to be written every which way, and you're going to have to rotate the document to understand it fully.
Was it common for people to be able to sign their name but not be able to write nor read otherwise?
I don't know if they could completely not read, but I've definitely come across the cases, and I think it was Evelyn asked the question about women. Like I've seen where the women, and so it was not uncommon to have somebody write a formal document for you, to hire somebody to write a formal document, but they sign it themselves, but you can tell the signature is quite hesitant, and it's not somebody that's used to writing has signed the document. Somebody else has actually written the body of it. So that's pretty common to come across.
When did you see a shift from quills to manufactured metal nibs in New Brunswick?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an exact answer for that. I would say a lot of the documents I work with, the Loyalist documents, are quills, not metal nibs. I think it would be a hard item, especially in the early years of the Loyalist settlement, to get a hold of that type of manufactured, depending, especially in your class as well.
Okay, my grade 2 teacher, who tied a bag over my left hand twice, told me that if I insisted on writing with the wrong hand, I'd never learn to write. Do you encounter much left-handed cursive? Is it markedly different from those others? That's our friend Mike again. Hi, Mike.
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a great
Yeah, I don't know if it'd be hard to with the ink. With the ink, it would be really hard to be left-handed because you drag your hand right through the ink. So you'd see those kind of smudges. There's definitely people that have different tilts to their writing. You see, with a right-handed, tend to see more right, but you do see the tilt to the left as well. But I guess I wouldn't know for sure if that person was left-handed. And yeah.
Okay, do you use the word sic, S-I-C, in transcribing?
Sick. You could, like, there is no hard, what I said is just my recommendations. You can use whatever convention you want. Yeah, for if you're, I would always recommend putting it exactly how it's spelled, because this can be important. Like, I've encountered this, I've done some place names around New Brunswick have changed greatly how they're spelled. And I think it's important to know how people at the time spelled it and how it's changed over time. So if you're going to do your interpretation of what it is, I would make sure that people understand that that is not how it's actually written on the document. So yes, you can do that with the square brackets. But I just would say if you're doing a lot of transcription, it's important to standardize, like just pick, if you're doing like a transcription project, pick one way you're doing it and have everybody that's working the project stick to that way of doing it.
Is copper plate same as round hand? Also, what other specific hands were used in New Brunswick in the 19th century?
I don't have a lot of background in educational history, so maybe somebody that's worked at the King's Landing School would know more about that than I would, but copper plate and round hand are similar. Copper plate would be a little bit later than round hand, but they're related. And of course, you could, sometimes things are going to go hover between two different types.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if India ink was used in New Brunswick, or what sort of inks were used.
Yeah, I'd have to refer to somebody else for like that. That would be the physical, that would be more of an anthropological question, I guess, that, or an archaeological question. Like sorry, I'd have to look into that. Yeah.
I know a lot of
Leah?
the old style home manuals had recipes for ink.
Yeah.
You can make them using things like bricks, but there's a lot of recipes for inks. Blueberry ink.
On the if you Google the early modern maritime recipe project, it has actual, exactly what Ruth was just talking about, recipes that include things like ink on it from this time period.
I'm curious about quill pens. Like, were they able to get the ink to go, inside the quill so they could write for a while, or did they have to continuously dip?
I think it stays in for a while if you cut it correctly. I haven't done a lot of it. I have tried it and had classes try to do it as well. It's definitely a skill, and you had to have a good pen knife, right, to cut your quill as well. I think it's a skill for sure.
I think quill was pretty much dip, but there's a little bit of a hollowness to a feather, so you could probably pick up a little ink, but it wouldn't be anything like a fountain pen would be. You wouldn't get very far on it, I wouldn't think. So, and then there's different qualities of feathers too. Goose were the ones that they tended to like, the big ones out of the goose wing.
Oh, is that right? Oh, okay.
Yeah, they were there were some that they were more coveted than others, and generally from the harder to get from birds. Like goose were like, yeah, you leave my feathers alone. Bottled liquid ink and also dry powdered pellet inks were available. Yeah, so if you go into old store records or newspaper ads that were listing their products, you can find out what people use that way. A lot of store records are available at the provincial archives, but Leah, your archives would have some too, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and newspapers.
Yeah, newspapers.
Ads in newspapers, yeah.
Yeah.
What I would like to announce to everybody here is that the Fredericton Region Museum will soon be launching its much and long awaited, and I am so excited, the archival transcription project. And in fact, if you want, you can see it at transcribe.frederictonregionmuseum.com, transcribe.frederictonregionmuseum.com, and you can see there's probably, I don't know, maybe 100 letters and postcards that have been transcribed, and we encountered all of those problems that you've discussed. and some problems were unsolvable, like there was just no way. And so if anyone has time in their hands and is interested in getting involved in the project, they can log on as a volunteer. We're just at the beginning to, populate the site with images of documents that have not been transcribed, because we have a lot that were transcribed, so we want to show them off. But would really love people to participate in that. So it's just at the beginning right now, but it looks lovely and I'm so proud of it. It's transcribe.frederictonregionmuseum.com.
Thank you so much, everybody. Hal and Mike and Leah and Melinda and Jackson. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Leah, for the wonderful program you gave. It's amazing what you can find in the archives. I'm so glad that you shared some tips and tricks on how to interpret those old letters and records that we so enjoy in this field. So if you do have further questions for Leah or the Fredericton Region Museum, you can email them at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com. That's all squished together, one word, Fredericton Region Museum, or call them at 506-455-6041. You can check out their website or their Facebook page for more information, for up-to-date information. And I guess we'll see you in September. Thank you.